Welcome to a good mood and also a book club episode 23 or 24 already. Like, holy cow. Like, that's 2 dozens. Um, I'm holding up the book. Here. It's still a third left. And I'm I like the reading kinda. I like the switching of the frame to the handy. Let's just say it that way. The extension of the hands of the agency with the pointing, the merging, the rectifying is is really fruitful. Also with the dreaming, like I don't know how I didn't remember all of the stuff, but I saw a lot of useful things there, and I'm like, why haven't I framed things in that manner? Um, so kind of excited for a change. um, and one of the things that a point does, especially on a needle, right? It's an initiation. It's like it's piercing an existing territory, space, and establishing something at that space, right? Like it might be a restoration of the space itself, or it might be an attachment onto the space, whatever it is. But I was kind of caught by this idea, right? Like, what is this point, right? Like, so there's something there, and like we've talked a lot in the past about this idea that who was it? The guy that founded Constantinople. Like he just started walking with the stick to like basically show how big the city should be, and he just kept on walking, and he was like, okay, till here, and that was how the city was ought to be built, right? So there's an element of divination there, right? Because it's like, which is also interesting, because that's got brought up, right? And like you can see divination as relating to something existing that you're not seeing, right, or you're not aware of, but you can still sense. And I like I have the sense that that's the same when you put the needle in the club, right? Like you're like, yeah, I kind of hear the attachment needs to happen, or here the restoration needs to happen, and that's intuition. Um, so I don't know, like I'm trying to participate in that process, this book club. Mark.
Yes, we are on 61, right? So, what I found interesting about this is again, we're sort of continuing, although I think we've expanded on the theme of, and it was RJ originally brought this up. Uh, I hope he's doing well, of showing things from different perspectives using these flat pictures. And again, this is more about the, what do I want to call it, the multi-connected aspect of the world, and that's the point of symbols, is to give you those, call them multiple ways in and multiple ways out, right? This multivariate to multivariate sort of way of reconnecting or recombining the world, right? Another word for that might be re-enchantment. And yeah, you're not re-enchanting the world, I get that. Also, we're living in individualistic times, and so the problem is people have disenchanted the world for themselves, and in doing so also for others. So um the yeah, and I liked your, dragging in Constantinople and the idea of, because that wasn't the first time that was done, right? They used to mark out the city. Um, Villages would get marked out with staves in the corners and stuff. This is not like this is standard fare, actually, because somebody has to enact the vision, And I think we're really getting to the point, because we're talking about tools and actions like spinning and weaving, and yoking, which is a constraint. We're getting to the point in the book where we're starting to get the more abstract concepts back into the pragmatic. And so that's what I'm sort of focused on here, in these next few sections, hopefully. So, Christopher.
Yeah, I've put my little title here as incrementally mediated, because it's been a week of trying to get things done and not being able to do them as much as I would like anyway. So you have to account for time and not compress it too much. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about things. Danny?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to say. So, I mean, I guess the arc of I was catching up on a lot of what was discussed and sort of weaving. I was anyway. I'm catching up. I was in a period of hyper productivity. I got sick, and so I'm sort of, as I'm reading this text and hearing like when Manuel talks about like intuition and thinking about the concept of work, there are like, I think about there are like different modes and there are seasons for work. There's a difference between counting the cost of things and being efficient versus getting lost in work. And so, like when you experience like a period of maybe productivity and then a period of losing your disciplines, etc., it takes a bit of a ritual of it's to sort of revitalize or reorient what you're dedicating yourself towards. So I'm just sort of experiencing that. I'm a little bit behind on some of the content of the book, other than like the diagrams at a high level, but I guess my experience is sort of biasing the way I'm interacting with this text. Sorry, that was long-winded. Um, so, just paying attention to the cost of things and the revivification. In short, who hasn't gone? Let's see, Manuel. Castle hasn't gone.
So my sort of subtitle here is tying up loose ends. I just wanted to mention quickly, I thought it was funny. My brain automatically filled in, Christopher, your subtitle is incriminatingly mediated and not incrementally, which I thought was pretty funny. But so I was like, a lot of the stuff that's been going on this week, and it's interesting because I hadn't actually bothered to touch this book until like yesterday, is that I've been tying up a lot of loose ends. And so it's one of the things that kind of comes up in this chapter is this aspect of like expressing the point and then also kind of actually finishing up something or rectifying, loose ends or unnecessary loops or that type of thing. And I've noticed that a lot of the things that I was working on, and to the point that Danny was making about the sort of like the cycle of like temporarily losing discipline and then having to kind of revivify. I've been experiencing that because I was sick for a little while, still kind of getting over that, but I did get my energy back this week. And so, despite the fact that I've been kind of off, there's a lot of unfinished business that I've had. And plus, we're getting to the end of the year. So, a lot of these things I'm kind of seeing at multiple scales all kind of happening all at once. And of course, that happened all in the same week that it came up in our readings. So, here we are.
Okay. Well, let's try and tie this together. Let's see if I'm at the right place. I am definitely not at the right place. That's still not far enough.
You're looking for 194. Oh, wait, sorry, 195.
There. Okay. So, yeah, we're talking about the practical, but we're also talking about tools. uh, Tools are a type of clothing, right? Like they're an interface between us and the world, right? They mediate. But they mediate our agency in some manner, right? And yeah, I want to immediately go to the graph, right? So when you have a tool, right, like the tool, we like to talk about tools in Aristotelian terms, right, with the four causes, right, and one of them is the purpose, right, of the tool, of the telos of the tool, and the purpose of the tool opens up an option space, right? Like it opens up a bunch of new participation, and by the opening up of the participation, it opens up organization. um, and I think that's what we're talking about, right? And so we can abstract that, and say, well, uh, there's manners in which these spaces, well, like I guess characteristics to these spaces, right? There's the form of these spaces, and they're like in some sense like the miniature versions of God's cosmic tool. Um, so maybe we want to stand still a little bit by what we would consider like a cosmic tool. Like
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when you think about technology tools in the Aristotelian sense, and that they open up the option space, right, is that like there's a fallacy that the internet would be like a bicycle for the mind, as like Steve Jobs, is famous for saying. Like tools do open up the possibility for organization, and I think if we have a lack of wisdom, then what fills that void, we could be things that maybe are not best for us. So
yeah, like I've actually been
like
seeing that.
you don't want to be given too powerful of a tool if you can't use it, right? You could
Right.
hurt yourself.
Yeah, I've been seeing that on the internet. They've been talking about, well, the medium is the message, right? Like they're talking about things like, well, if we create the tool, then we got created by the tool, right? And it's like, well, that's not how it works, right? Like you still pick up the tool, right? Like, and so like if you pick up the tool without proper telos, right? Like without a way to, well, to fill in the space or to rectify things, as in the diagram, then you end up in some sort of possession, right? Like because then you're just in the emergence relationship.
Yeah,
I have.
I want to point out a couple things. The book starts with structure. Tool comes later. And one way to think about that is to flip it around and say, wisdom is knowing what a valid tool is. And tools, I mean, the organization precedes you, right? Order precedes all of this stuff. I mean, that has been the progression of the book, is that the created order is already there. And then if you start to confuse that, let's say you're a materialist, the medium is the message is a materialist way of saying, oh, no, the objects around us, the material, in this case, the structure, which is represented by objects in either case, moves us, which is incorrect, right? We move objects. And so understanding that, and also understanding, for example, that it's not that rectification can't happen this way, but it's more likely to be regression. That's entropy. Like entropy is most likely going to create regression, but can also create rectification. So don't be thinking that if you don't do anything, once you've built something, it'll be fine, right? Because no, every time you build something, you need to maintain it. And a lot of people, especially people who are, we'll say, super competent or ultra capable or something, who are able to do too many things, will do too many things, but they won't be able to maintain all those things. And if they don't have the infrastructure to maintain them, i.e. other people helping them, then it does them no good to build those things. And I think that people a lot of times just miss that very important fact. It's like, oh, it's wonderful that you can build 92,000 things. Can you maintain them? Right? Because regression is always going to happen. And the fact that rectification happens seemingly randomly, although you could argue with whether or not that anything's truly random, is not a license to do nothing, right? Or to just let things happen and not interfere or any of that stuff. So I think those are important distinctions, right? Because work matters, and work matters a lot, and thought is not work. Right? It may feel like effort to you, and it may be effort to you, but it's not work because it's not outside of you.
Yeah, and I think I want to introduce the team that all of the tools that we're talking about, they're like really immediate in their impact in the life, right? So they participate highly. So what happens, right, is like when I look at my kitchen, I have 25 different things there, right? And so but if you live in a more simple environment, right? Like we're gonna talk about wool and weaving and clothing and pots and all of these things, right? They directly participate in your daily activities, right? Because they're in your clothing. So you're also building the world, right? The container that fills your daily life, right? So like it's more than just a tool, all right? Like they're uh, they're in, they're activities or actions that have immediate feedback and felt feedback, right? And a story behind it, right? So you also know the pot that you're cooking in because you made it, right? Or you, you, your husband made it, whatever, like, or your neighbor made it, um, and so things become enchanted, right? Like they don't come at you via the mail with nice glazing and all the stuff on it. No. Like there's a story behind it, and maybe your kid went out to get the clay and all of that. And so we Maturity mentions it a little bit later on, but like these things they participate in meaning, right? Like they're also a way of capturing meaning in life and also weaving uh, time effectively, right? Like it's weaving all the activities that you're doing into a whole, right? That's the structure that's going on beyond that.
So I was thinking about this a little bit, and just kind of looking at it a bit. Something that kind of came up as I was seeing just that line there about God's cosmic tool. I just kind of went back and looked at the thing just in case for the folks at home, it's not necessarily saying that he's using like a giant pair of chopsticks or something like that to kind of put things together, but
It's a pocket knife.
yeah. But this thing about tool comes from ta, which means to prepare, and like literally specifically to prepare leather. So you're kind of talking about this connection between like a school and clothing, and this sort of thing of like a container or like dry land or something like that. It's this aspect of straightening something out. You think like, oh, this person's clothes are all disheveled. You got to straighten you up a little bit. It's not necessarily going to manifest as like an actual like straight line, but there's something very intuitive about seeing if something is straightened up or if it isn't. And so if you're seeing just kind of like setting up stability as such as the means of preparation that he's using, and then just kind of seeing that happen with both like him providing the garments of skin to Adam and Eve, but also the actual like setting up the containers for the entire universe at the different scales as well.
I think one of the things I noticed here was that when you're using tools, tools are what you use to refine the matter. And what you do, you have like in this picture, you have a little like the stuff underwater there, and you put it, above water towards this point. You use tools to do that, and you've refined the matter towards this point. You haven't just you're not just rearranging it. which is a thing that people tend to talk like they're doing when they're trying to build or organize something. They think let's rearrange this way, but what you're doing, you're moving towards the point, the final cause, the telos, you're refining matter towards that point.
No way. The image kind of came up for me as you were saying that of kind of, I don't know if you've ever done like a tie-dye shirt. It's been many years since I've done that, but just this kind of thing of, you know, you put it in a certain way and you express it into a point as you're doing these things. If you were just dunking the entire white shirt into all of that, into all of those colors, you would just get like a brown gray shirt. Like it would just be just like an ugly sort of thing. So you do have to be intentional about how you're applying the pattern, and you're not just putting it in flat or randomly. Like you actually do have to straighten it out in order to start to apply those things.
So at the bottom of the page it says, in this case the pointed tool is the needle and the raw matter it's the loose thread, right? And so and the way that you can envision that, it's the head and the tail, right? So the head provides meaning and the tail follows, right? And the tail leaves a trail as well, right? So there's a permanence in there as well, right? Because the needle itself isn't part of the restoration, right? It's facilitating the restoration or whatever, like the the addition, and so it's interesting that in some sense, right? Like, so the loose thread, right? You can connect that to the snake, obviously, right? But if you put a thread in a cloth or whatever, right? Like now it's no longer loose, right? Like now it's bound. So it solidifies in a manner, right? And like I think that might even be analogous to like the snake climbing the tree, right? Because if it's wound around the tree, it's also solidified. Yeah, and so like yeah, like what's the point doing, right? Like it's leading, just like with the founding of Constantinople, right? Like the point is pointing at what needs to happen. Uh, it's in some sense setting the aim, uh, and then things follow up, right? And then like what follows is either like Christopher said, right? Like it's fulfilling the telos, or it's a random mess. Okay, let's go to the next page. So yeah, I already kind of mentioned this, but when we're sewing, right, like we're adding to an existing fabric or space, right? And so you're you're weaving into something or adding on to something by penetrating it, which is interesting.
I like what he mentions at the very top of the page, that the miniature axis can be both a needle but also a pair of needles. So you can have, and then he says that it's a symbol of focusing power to distribute a point. So I just thought it was a nice little mention there, that you can have multiple like, you know, I don't want to say axes, because then that kind of implies like, oh, then you've got like the axle and all these different things, but you can have the same sort of manifestation of the axis happening in multiple instances, all focusing to distribute a point as well. That sort of thing just kind of calls to mind like the cherubim on the tabernacle, but also just kind of like, you know, you get multiple people kind of agreeing on the same thing and working together on something to express the point. That you can have that, and just kind of imagining that with the process of doing things like crocheting and that sort of thing, They don't actually have to be performing exactly the same function. They could be complementary, but they're still, to your kind of previous point, they're still penetrating the same sort of like focal point to perform the work before kind of continuing on.
Yeah, so when you're sewing, you're getting like a specific point, a specific interaction, but then he goes further about knitting, and he's talking about the knot, right? And knots don't really have a center, right? Like they're like gathering around something, right? So they're holding a point or something, or they're around a point, but they're not themselves a point. Um, so it's like a binding of space in some sense, right? Because or a constellation, right? And then if you consider like weaving or something, right? Like it's like a whole a bunch of binding of space bound to each other, right? So you get the well, not the well, you get an additional space that's the space of spaces. Let's just call it that way. Um, and that space is then used for clothing or something, right? So like then that's also another space covering your body.
Yeah. Well, the weaving creates a barrier, right? That doesn't pre-exist, and knots create a barrier usually of length to something, right? And so this is more about constraint in this context. And yeah, you can look at sewing as a restoration, right? Because you're taking things and putting them together in a way. Weaving is taking things and putting them together in a different way. It's a tighter binding. And weaving is, you've probably heard the expression, create from whole cloth, right? Weaving is the creation of cloth from component, basically. Whereas, when you're sewing, you're doing that to bind pieces of cloth together, typically, right? And so that, it's a very different. There are two very different ways of exemplifying loosening and tightening, right? And that's part of it. It is that you need the barrier, the constraint to create the space, right, or to contain the space. It's a better way to say it. And without that, you've got a problem, right? And the problem is you can't differentiate. And that's why this is important, because it takes tools to do this. In other words, you don't create space by going, oh, I've got a mystical group of people and they're all programmers. And it's like, but that doesn't work, right? You have to have constraints and lines of delineation. It will say are able to be discerned by other people. That's why you can't just say you're part of a group. That doesn't. You can't say, "Oh, I'm part of the Illuminati because I said so," which is a famous joke among conspiracy theorists. If maybe you don't know that, but it is. To claim you're part of the Illuminati, you'll get a big chuckle out of certain groups of people who partake in the Illuminati conspiracy, the proper one, the original one, which was a LARP. It was a joke in and of itself. And that difference between sewing and weaving is important, right? Because again, with sewing, there's something pre-existing. You don't sew your way into clothing, but you do weave your way into clothing. So I just wanted to make that that distinction clear. And yeah, weaving, depending upon how knot purist you are, knots are not mere weaving. It's like they're more like complex methods of weaving. And as I said, they're usually designed to constrain length, whereas weaving is designed to create a barrier, right? Which can be used for constraint. So those are just important sort of differences to understand But it's interesting, right? Because he uses the idea of containers, and then in parentheses says spaces, right? And so it's not technically the creation of space, but it could be the manifestation of space. But another way to think about it is the delineation of space. The delineation of space happens through a container. That's how containers work, right? They're delineations of space. That's why you can do things in them, and they have to have stuff done in them, right? Otherwise, they're just excluding things, which may have its own benefit, but it's not like you can do without containers.
Yeah, I like the mention as well of the sewing needing to be something on something that's already pre-existing versus this thing of there's this nice old lady that taught me how to crochet when I trained her how to dispatch years back, and we were working night shift, and one of the things is that you can very easily get your stuff wrong. And that's one of those things is that you don't really need a pattern to participate in when it comes to sewing and rectifying stuff. You can kind of just do it. Like there's better ways of doing it. You can be good at it, but also it's easy to sew something or patch something and just kind of get it done if you just have like the basic concept down. Whereas if you're trying to like make like a beanie hat or something or like a scarf, like there is a necessity to have at least a basic pattern. Otherwise, you're going to get some sort of lopsided mess, and maybe that's okay. Like maybe that in a sense you're kind of trying to just rectify an issue of being cold or something like that, and just anything will do. But also to the point of like, oh, you can't just say, oh, I'm a part of a group. You can't just say like, I crocheted a thing, and it's just like it doesn't actually serve any sort of function. I mean, you can definitely make the same sort of motion over and over again, but really it's just a whole bunch of knots at that point, not serving any sort of purpose if you did it with that, like at least some sort of vague pattern in mind when you went into it.
Yeah, so extending from the graph, right? So if you have a thread, right, like you can put that into a textile, right, to create a surface. But if you don't, right, like if you don't work on it, right, or then it forms a ball, right, and like it gets its own knots, right. So there's a potential in the thread, right, and it's going to be actualized in a way, right, because like the thread can't exist as a thread because it will tangle, and so it's interesting that when it like just forms a ball by itself, right, like then you got this well condensed potential, but like Castle said, right, like you just made something that's useless, right, like it doesn't have any purpose, right, or you make a surface, right, like there's a yeah, in some sense it's explained, right, like it's making a plane. um and thereby it's also instantiated, right, like so the potential gets a specific form, an instance. And yeah, below in the text below, it starts talking about baskets, weaving baskets, right? So this is like a different layer of application, right? Because like now we're going to like a 3D form, um, and and the space that gets created by that 3D form is different than the weaving of the 2D form. Um, and in some sense, you can see that the pattern occurs at different layers of application, right? So there's an interaction where the third dimension is relevant, and then there's an interaction where you actually try to avoid engaging in the third dimension.
Well, yeah, and I mean he goes into spinning. So spinning is creating threads. You can use threads for sewing, knots, or weaving, right? And so the thread is not a three-dimensional thing. The thread is that smaller thing from which you create the larger things. right? Which then create larger things. So you can't denote three-dimensional space with a flat piece of fabric, right? But you can sew the fabric with other pieces of fabric to create a three-dimensional container, right? And all containers are obviously three-dimensional. You need all of those constraints, and he's linking the spinning to the cyclical time and the weaving to the formation of space. Right, and one's more complex than the other, right? Which should be immediately obvious, but might not be. And yet, I think Mitchell's commenting on my channel. Yeah, you don't have to weave with thread. There's other you can weave leaves and bamboo and other items as well. So that is part of creation of space, but the spinning is part of the creation of cyclical time, because it goes on in some sense, right, in a linear fashion.
And so like spinning, right, also is used by people when like spin doctors, for example, right? Like they're tying things together in a manner to present to you, and then there's also like the weaving of narratives into a story, right? So there's these analogies extend beyond the physical, and they're used a lot.
I guess one thing, this is not really related to anything. I've just been thinking about, if you go to like in North Carolina, the Biltmore, it's got the Vanderbilt estate, who's a steel tycoon or something, and when he commissioned like some special people to create what are the largest tapestries, and many of the largest tapestries in North America. And I was thinking about, like, have we lost the taste? Like, it used to be that where all the wealth was concentrated, they would commission, they would have commission projects for these great unique pieces of work to be worked on for like 10 years. Like they would plan the estate construction for like 20-30 years to build the house and stuff. So I was thinking about, like, where is that today? Is it dead? Should it be dead? Like, we've lost the taste for things like maybe the orchestra, because that's more interested. Like, we've lost the ear for it. It's more driven by like movies and stuff. It's been influenced in different ways. But like, if you think about, is that just an aristocratic taste that like, or has art just moved on, or is that I don't know what to make of that. But it was just sort of an observation that that was only the late 1800s maybe, and I'm just kind of thinking about, like, what is that as a category? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Danny, it's a good point. I mean, it is totally related. When you lose the poetic way of informing the world, you don't understand the importance or the beauty or the truth or the goodness of weaving. And Vanderbilt wasn't steel; he was shipping and later railroads. But interesting story. Man who built America on History Channel. A great series. What more broadly, what they were doing, and I haven't been to the Biltmore yet. I gotta go, but I've been to the ones up in New England, obviously. The cottages in Rhode Island, the little summer homes. They used them for 3 months a year. Gorgeous. I mean, they're insanely gorgeous, right? But what were they doing? So a lot of that stuff, and if you get up to Boston, the best place to see it is Boston. When you go to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, you can go down to Newport, Rhode Island, and see the cottages if you want. And there's other places. There's a couple of other houses here and there. There's only a couple down south. Biltmore is one of them, right? They were importing things from Europe. And by things, I mean people. Right? They were importing physical objects and craftsmanship from the, quote, old world to the new world to create what came to be known as the nouveau riche, right? Which was there to exemplify, and the Puritans would have been upset. I lived amongst them to some extent. I'm French, damn it. We're not Puritans. They were iconoclasts. So they were, everybody dresses the same. Nobody shows their wealth. I mean, in New England, even now, you up to New England, it's very hard to tell who's wealthy. Because long before Steve Jobs, they were, maybe slightly newer clothes than everybody else. But you could tell, like if you went skiing with a wealthy family, they all had very old skis that were very well taken care of, right? So they weren't big consumers. Whereas the rise of that in the United States was New York City. Rivalry is older than that, but they're trying to exemplify the unification of the world. Like for real, like that's their goal. And maybe that's a good goal. I mean, maybe that's what we were missing, or what we needed to become, what we became in the sort of post-industrial boom, because the late 1800s, early 1900s is the period we're talking about. Bringing in that exemplification from Europe gives us something to look up to and unify towards. And that's what we're missing. That's why this book is important, because without symbolism, you can't actually do that. And the argument that we make is you need the poetic way of informing the world in order to understand symbolism. So if you already have that, and you might, because you might have been going to church all along, and you might not have fallen into a meaning crisis, and or you might still be going to church, you might never have stopped. The symbolism isn't a problem for you. But if you didn't have that, or you didn't have enough symbolism, or whatever, you didn't have enough church, or you were out of it for too long, you might have lost the skill of poetically informing the world, which allows you to weave together, sew together, and knot together the world at all layers of reality, right? Because again, this scales, this is all scaling up and down in the so-called vertical causality space. Sloppy way to talk about it, but it works. And so at each scale, and this, again, this is what these diagrams in particular are trying to do, right? To show you that you can just apply this at different scales, right? And see that, like, you could say a company, a corporation, is a weaving together, right? A creation of space, because we talk about companies like entities, we treat them like entities, legal entities, which is important because otherwise they're not subject to the law. So that's always nice. And because they're entities, then they become forces in the world, effectively. And their force comes from their employees, right? And this is where the so-called valid, that is absolutely not valid, critique comes from about workers aren't paid fairly. Like, you need their agency to run the corporation. Well, yes, all right, but the weaving wasn't done by them, and they can't do the weaving, or they would have done it, right? Like, well, then the weaving's more valuable, right? And therefore, and yeah, there's all sorts of downstream second order effects from all of that, because it's scaled up, and they're huge because it's scaled up. But it's the same as weaving, right? It's exactly the same as any form of weaving, or quilting, or any number of things. And that's actually really important to realize. And I don't think that people have a sense for that whole idea. So I wanted to kind of make that clear. So it is right up, like the Biltmore estate, and the fact that, like, people used to, well, and to some extent, Biltmore is very hard to get into around Christmas. You gotta plan a year in advance, because they do Christmas lights. But the fact that people are drawn to the beauty, or the past majesty, we might call it, is actually important, right? And that was our attempt at legitimizing our nation, if you will. That whole time period, the so-called Gilded Age, that's what it was all about. And so we stole whole castles from Europe and tried to bring them here. But there was no need. We have our own castle in our book club. So we've already got one.
So I went to Dublin University, and they have like a library there where they have a massive what's it called, tapestry. That's the word. And what I think what they displayed on the tapestry is like the history of Ireland, right? So it's like a narrative contained in the weaving. Um, and like it was this massive project where like 100 noble women or something spent like 3 years of their lives working on that thing. And but you can see that it's it's literally binding the nation together, right? Like it's trying to nationalize, trying to establish a common narrative, right? A common point of reference. Um, and so like if you want to say, well, isn't art doing that anymore? Like, well, no. Like most modern or postmodern art can't deal with narrative, right? Because like that be an imposition, right? Because if you establish a narrative, then everybody has to conform to the narrative, right? And then you offend people. Um, so yeah, like I think you could say maybe movies nowadays, right? Like they're trying to take things from culture and weave them together into a narrative, so that like we can kind of as a collective take stock of where we are and have a common point of reference. But yeah, that's been a disaster. So yeah.
Yeah, I think art has to point up. And when art doesn't point up, you're not looking up. And if art doesn't point up, it's not weaving things together to point up. And so that's where, we'll say, all the problems come into the world. And I think actually that's a really important point that needs to be understood, because it's actually super important that art fulfills its role as weaving together the world towards the something outside and above.
Yeah, so if we continue, we can see the analogy of working a field, dressing the land. Um, so what the way that I envisioned it is that like what you do with a hoe is like you're intervening, right? You're creating a hole or whatever, and then you're designating that place to be sown with a seed. So what you're effectively doing is you're designing, right, or you're directing the land to manifest in a certain manner. Um, and I think the connection of intentionality, right? Because basically what you're doing is you by having the point exert itself, you let nature conform to your will. And at the bottom of the page, it's talking about dual purposes, which I really like. But the fact that a knot binds things, but also prevents things from being entangled at the same time, right? So there's, it's interesting that you can look at the two directionalities, right? So like when you make a field, right, around the city, you don't have a tree line, right? So you have far sight, like stuff like that. Like there's dual purposes in these things. Like the absence of certain things is also has a use. Let's just say it that
But yeah, and it's important to recognize that things that are not ordered will tend to fall to chaos. And that's really, what's, part of what you were talking about, right? Like, if you don't order the things, they'll fall to chaos. Like a single thread dropped on the floor will tend toward knotting itself in a random fashion that will annoy and possibly frustrate you for a long time to come. And that's why it's actually important to, if you've ever been to a water-powered mill, and if you haven't, there's plenty in Lowell. You just go to the museums there. It's important to do that process continuously, right? Because then you just come out with a super fast, efficient garment, run totally on water, and the threads never get like lost, or they never become a problem, because you can do all the spinning and weaving as one continuous set of processes and not risk that. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, right? You can spin it, put it on a spool, and then use it to weave, right? That's how it used to be done. But you have to order it after you spin it. Otherwise, again, you drop the thread, it'll tangle naturally. That's entropy. So that's where the problem comes in, is that if you don't take the responsibility for ordering things will fall to disorder. And to Danny's earlier point, when you don't exemplify what good order looks like, say by having art that points up towards the highest, and maybe you have to steal that from Europe because there's too many iconoclasts in your country, then you do that. Like, that's what you do. That is actually the correct answer. And yeah, I mean, look, everybody can't participate in that, but everybody doesn't have to participate directly in it. Everyone has a role in the hierarchy to play. And if you try to get rid of icons, right, you destroy the world. So don't do that. That's not hard. Just don't put your time, energy, attention into that.
And that's interesting because Mark pointed out the social fabric there. Because if you see that there's a bunch of people that have a point of contact with the meaning, right, it gets woven into the social fabric because it becomes a part of common parlance, right? So like you can see it happen on Twitter, right, or X. Like there's things start entering the zeitgeist, and even if you don't have direct contact, you still get exposed like indirectly and start adopting certain behavioral patterns because that's just the way that the spirit is flowing. Yeah, so I think it's also important to realize that when you let a thread fall, it kind of doesn't tangle. It tangles when you pick it up. It's like there's a rebellion to participation in there somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that people misuse this idea of social fabric, right? Fabric is something that's woven together. The things that affect you that are not ordered are not part of a fabric, right? In other words, you can't have the thread and have it in a state of not ordered because you don't want a hierarchy, or you like to rebel, or you don't want a constraint, and also not chaotic, right? Like, there's a trade-off there. And when you don't recognize that, and when you don't recognize that if that thread exists in the world, and the fact that it's not your thread doesn't mean that it's okay if it's disordered. That's actually the opposite of how it works. Like, it actually matters that every thread is ordered. Because if they're not, there's no social fabric. And when there's no social fabric, there's no container. There's no way of telling where you are in the world, hence the meaning crisis, right? There's also no way of having a quality relationship with people because you don't know how far away from them you are, right? And so the fact that you're in a world and that you affect the world and the world affects you is irrelevant to whether or not there's a social fabric. Like, that's going to happen, fabric or no. If you have a social fabric to help you with that fact, then you live in a better world. And when that social fabric breaks down, like it does on places like X, inevitably, by the way, there's technical reasons for that, mathematical models that show this, then you're still affected. And even the people who have a social fabric are affected, right? That's kind of like if you have an uncle who's a drug addict, that affects the whole family, like it or not, right? Like that impact isn't going away. Even if they're not part of the family, their absence affects the family. There's no way around the connectedness. So the question is, you put in the responsibility, the time, energy, and attention to get people to recognize that they need to be responsible for the fabric, right? Because that's what it's all about. And then you have to give them the tools to do that, because if they're not familiar with sewing versus weaving versus quilting versus crocheting, right? Even though they have similarities, they're fundamentally different in important, what we'll call them ontological ways, based on their procedures and interactions and the telos of the tools, how many tools there are, for example, and then they can't do the work, even if they know about it. And that's why the talkie doesn't do much good, because if you know, like if you can talk about how to program, but you don't actually program, it doesn't help. And if you program something, not everybody needs to use your program the way you intend. And also, some people could use your program, at least if it's like open source or the source is available, and fix bugs. That's one mode of interaction. Other people will just use your program without even knowing who you are or what happened. Right? Those are different modes or hierarchies of participation. That's inevitable. This is a good thing. This is how we build the world. But you have to have that sense, right? You have to sort of understand all that. I just want to address this. But what if you listen to jazz? Like, you can listen to jazz. There's nothing wrong with jazz. I like jazz. I like, improvised jazz. We'll say better than we'll say the genre jazz, which is kind of all over the place. That's all about picking up the threads, especially improvisation in general, is all about picking up the threads and weaving them in the moment, right? Using tools specifically. And those threads, we'll say, are not necessarily pre-existing. But what you're really doing is taking the thread of your instrument. We'll just use trumpet. That's probably the most famous example and the easiest to find in jazz. And you're listening to the structure that's already provided, right? And often in really good jazz, there's a beat and there's no structure. In any instruments, sort of like one person starts, usually the drummer, right? Usually. One person starts. And then over time, a structure builds, right? That's fine. These are musicians, though. It's not random people off the street can't do this reliably. You can watch the internet, you'll see it, right? And then usually the last person to come in is the trumpeter, right? The horn player. And the horn player will do the cool horn playing thing. And what they're doing is they're connecting that structure together in new and different ways, right? And providing you a way to see how you can participate with something bigger than yourself. This is really what jazz is all about on that type of jazz. It's about, how do I take my pre-existing skill that I've practiced over time, which you didn't see and didn't think about because you're just there to enjoy the music. Oh, interesting, right? You weren't paying attention to the gorilla in the middle of the basketball passing. And how do I make that? How do I exemplify that? Show you usually the skill of the horn player, right? And how that skill can be used to enhance your experience. But if you listen to good improv jazz, that happens on a ramp up over time, usually. If it's good, I would argue it always happens that way, right? And they may be playing, and this is actually much harder to do. They may be playing a well-known jazz tune, right? But the way they play it has these subtle little differences. And if they're really, really good, which is very, very, very rare, the harder it gets, the rarer it gets, they will never play that version twice. And that's how you know you're listening to really good jazz, right? And the only way you're going to get that version twice is with a recording, which is why, you could easily argue, and some people do, that recordings are bad, especially for music. And they might cause too much repetition, right? They might encourage pop music as such. Maybe pop music can't exist without recording. No, I definitely can't. Sorry. I'm just going to tell you right now. Sorry. And maybe that would be better for the world. I don't know. I know which way I'm leaning on that. The fact that I mentioned it should tell you which way I'm leaning on that. So the idea of forcing a participation in the moment, and in some ways the rise of jazz improv music as such is all about trying to regain what we already had, which was skills in participating in events as they happen, right? And that's like really important to understand, is that that's actually what's going on, whether you realize it or not. Which, look, it's okay if you don't realize it. It's still okay to like jazz. Thanks for the compliment. Also, thanks for making me articulate this, because I'm sure I've done it in parts of it in pieces before, but having to put it all together like this because we're reading this book, probably couldn't have done it without the book. Thank you, Matthieu Pageau. I appreciate it. That's what this book is about. The ability to start seeing things at that level and tying them together at that level, right? Because they're not simple, and it's okay if you don't understand them, right? Like, you can participate in things you don't understand. At some level, I don't quite understand this book club, and yet it works wonderfully, right? I mean, this is a form of jazz, especially when we get wonderful, insightful, and well thought out questions. So keep those coming, and we'll do our best to kind of answer them. So that's how the weaving and the spinning works. We'll say, I don't know if is that 2 layers up. It might be 3 layers up even. I don't know. That's how that works in the musical system, right? And of course, as you get higher, there's just more moving parts. And this is where, like, John Vervaeke would invoke combinatorial explosion or whatever. Combinatorial explosion just says science doesn't work. That's really all it says. Came up with that in the shower this morning. So there you go. I probably said it before, but I was like, no, I think I'm going to double down on that. And yeah, you can't, in other words, you can't map it to the math anymore. The math gets too complex and you just can't do it. And that's an amazing thing, that, like, you can't map jazz to math, and yet you can appreciate jazz without understanding any of what I just described is going on, right? But that weaving together, it's also why people like live music. It's not the only reason. There's lots of reasons to like live music. I don't really like live music. It's too many people, but I like small clubs where people play jazz, improv jazz. But that whole idea, like, it just gets more and more. There's more and more moving parts. Like, if you go to a big concert in particular, we'll say, right? Whereas if you go to a small symphony, so if you ever get the chance to go, I think they still do it. Although they might have switched concert halls. In the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, it's literally across the street from the Museum of Fine Arts, which is the lesser museum, in my opinion. You can listen to concerts. I think it seats 20 people. Like, so that's it. It's not. It wasn't easy to get in, but I did do that on one occasion, and it was amazing. I think it was a violinist actually who was playing, but yeah, amazing stuff. And that's a very different experience from going to a big stadium concert, or like I just saw ELO recently on their farewell tour. Very different experience. Don't go to Boston for concerts. Go to Madison Square Garden, get in quicker. Yeah. So but that's what this book is about, is figuring, like, being able for you to appreciate that, even if you can't, we'll say, articulate it or understand it or, appreciate it fully, that's okay. But being able to appreciate that there is a majesty to the world, because there is an ordering that pre-existed you that you can experience and participate in.
So I want to, Cassie, you want to go in or?
Well, I have a few things that I was just going to add in, but I don't know if I should go first or not.
Well, I want to focus at the social fabric for a second, right? So you can see like a fabric that would be in the army, for example, right? Like if you pull on a thread in the army, you get a unified, coherent response, right? And everybody will take the same position towards you, or the same relationship towards you, because they're unified, right? But like if you pull on a thread on Twitter, right? Like everybody who's drawn their lines, right? They're not all confused, right? And then you get bickering and infighting and all of these issues, because the thing that they thought they shared like got destroyed effectively by pulling on it. And you can look at James Lindley trying to weaponize that, right? It's like, well, I'm just going to do this hoax, right? And then I'm just going to, like, well, we'll get into it, show everybody's naked, right? Because I know what they were going to react like or something. It's like, yeah. At a certain point, right? Like when you're trying to play these games, it becomes stupid, right? Because like I've been saying that James Lindy is fighting phantoms, right? Because like when you see a thread and you see people relate to that thread and say like that's one thing or something, right? Like they're unified. Now you're inferring the fabric that just isn't there, right? And then you pull it, and it's like, well, like, okay, like a bunch of things happened, but like nobody cared but you. I guess that's that's the point.
Okay, so sorry, I was just making a note. So there's a bunch of stuff that I wanted to add to everything that just got mentioned over the last like 30 minutes or however long. So I wanted to quickly make a mention. So there was this aspect that you guys mentioned about, on the edge of a city, you have either a tree line or you have it completely just as a clearing. You have that advantage of kind of the extension of your site, but also the kind of, there is, depending on what you're looking to do, and this could go not only with kind of like dressing the outskirts of the city or something like that, with having a tree line, you can dispose of things. You can have your chopped wood and all that stuff, and it'll blend in really nicely there. Whereas if you have, a clearing, there's a lot of things that wouldn't be acceptable, that they would be an eyesore if you had that there, and you'd have to set up a completely different location. But I was thinking about that with respect to like a person's clothes. So this thing of like being more identifiable by having a clearing on your clothes. Like a lot of times I wear just plain colors most of the time. Is a lot easier for me, but there's certain advantages to, say, if a person wears graphic tees and they work outdoors and they're dealing with stuff getting on their shirt, it's a lot less likely that people are going to notice that than if you're wearing like a somewhat lightly colored, like solid color shirt or something like that. Whereas one of those would be more appropriate in an artificial space. Say if you're showing up for a meeting or something like that, or you're going to lunch with somebody, it's a lot less likely, the more refined or artificial that space is, that you would want more unusual designs on you. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about so there was this thing then with spaces, like especially like meeting spaces. So this past week I was at a meeting, and normally they meet in a particular room And something was mentioned earlier about, people outside the organization or community can pull on a string, or they can cause a tangle, or if they get tangled in for whatever reason, like if a community meets at a place and that place is run by a larger organization or something like that, then in a sense you've been tacked on, or you've been kind of like patched on to that thing. And if something doesn't go right with the larger structure, then that also tangles up your thing and causes confusion. Or if someone in that larger structure starts to pull at a particular string, then they can start kind of unraveling your thing. And I saw that explicitly this week, where normally this group meets in a specific room of this building, and they had pretty much reserved the same room on the same time, same day of every week for the entire year. And they did that, a year in advance and everything. And then they were told, no, you don't have it reserved. So they had to go to a different location. Turns out the secretary made a mistake, but after they realized that, then, it was too late. So they ended up in the side community center, a different building, walking distance from the other one. And I noticed there that it was a brand new building. They spent an enormous amount of money on it. And it was extremely plain. Like it was a very strange thing to kind of experience, that there was nothing really notable about this building, as new as it was, because they wanted to make it as like modular and like reusable for many different purposes. And for that reason, it had like, the truck stop bathroom lighting and like somewhat low ceilings. And then it just had, it was just a giant white room. And it's supposed to be a place where people can do like wedding ceremonies or like receptions, or whatever. But we were just doing like kind of a business meeting in this place. And even still, there was something like just so distasteful about it. And I think that itself, it was interesting to me, because as plain as everything was, you could kind of see the inconsistencies or impurities by just how plain it was. And considering that this was also a church building, like there's just nothing to indicate that this was. And but then the fact that there was a lot of strings that had been getting pulled these last few weeks by outside people within the overarching organization, who had been kind of like plucking at certain stuff that wasn't really their business to, and that actually created some infighting. I actually raised voices and cursing, and I was like, this is amazing. It's actually playing out in real time, like 10 feet in front of me. And it was important. They worked through it more or less, probably to be continued. But the point is, it's like all of this stuff of the unraveling or untangling or people pulling on threads they shouldn't was happening like right in front of me this week. So that was a cool thing socially. And then I just wanted to add to the jazz thing. I 100% agree. This book club is a jazz book club. That's like, even with the setting up the intentions at the beginning, and then we all go like after all that stuff, there was as a team, I haven't played in forever, but I would play alto saxophone, and there was this chance I had as a teenager with a bunch of other teenagers where we went to a place where the jazz band from a place called Preservation Hall in New Orleans came over, and there's all these like really old jazz players that were extremely talented. And they took all of us amateur teenagers who didn't know what we were doing. We just had, we had been playing, the same instrument for maybe a year max or something like that, undisciplined. And so they took us and they just kind of set us up with doing like they would say, okay, you're going to do this. They would just give each person a certain thing. They'd sort us by category and then just kind of do that. And it's just like, okay, this doesn't really sound like anything. Everyone kind of had their intention given to them. They participated in it and everything. And then at the end, as to your point, like the conductor was also the trumpeter. And then he shows up and it's like, oh, we're doing When the Saints Go Marching In or something. And it's just like, oh, there it is. Like I couldn't even see it until the last guy tied it all together, and then he goes and does his solo. But that was the thing, is you wouldn't get that same version ever again, So, but also the space for that event was it was very clearly a musical space. So that was another thing too. Like, I don't think it would have worked if they didn't have something to really show you like, hey, this entire place is built for this. And whereas the other stuff is like, if you don't have enough constraint, then everyone is just kind of like, how do we actually interact with this?
Yeah, and that's part of it. I wanna sort of point out, bound up is also held, right? Like if somebody holds you, they're actually binding you up. The difference is very subtle, and it's usually perception. Which is not to say a binding can't be too tight or somebody can't hold on to you too tightly. Of course they can, but from the outside, those are the same thing. And so the change in perspective makes it important. And I also wanted to say, yeah, I mean, the reason why the dirt shows in the Stark building or on the plain clothing is because it's not being held properly by the fabric, right? Or by the ornamentation, right? Which allows for some camouflage of imperfection. In fact, crown molding. What's that about? Oh yeah, you're hiding the imperfection of the seam of the wall and the ceiling. It's actually what it's for. and so like you that weaving, that intricacy is what helps to hide perfection both behind it and on in front of it, right? Because this is what it's all about. And when you don't have that higher social fabric to hold your society together, you get very bad results. You can just look around, right? You get strange effects, unknown drones from an unknown place, which is impossible. So someone's lying about something, right? But then they're allowed to lie, right? You get people not being held accountable for any number of crimes, client lists not being released, right? You get OnlyFans people claiming they're not prostitutes because porn somehow is suddenly not prostitution, which of course is silly, right? These are all holes in a fabric, right? Or the absence of a fabric that's not sort of holding things together anymore.
So I want to extend on the binding, right? So you have handcuffs, you have wedding rings, you have bracelets, right? And they're all in some sort. They're like a binding of the will, right? So like the wrist is the connection to the hand, right? Your agency, and if you have something that is interrupting the connection from your head to your hand, that's like a binding of your hands, right? And like the binding in the way that you can express yourself. Um, and someone hand holding you is the same thing, right? Like when they're holding your hand while you're practicing something or going through something difficult. It's the same thing, right? Your will is constrained and you're participating in their will. And I also wanted to point out one of these weird buildings is also a hospital, right? Like they have really, like they're literally designed for navigation and cleanliness at the same time, and it gets really weird. um, yeah, are we good to go to the next page, or did someone want to butt in on these long tirades?
I'll just mention that talking about the social fabric and binding things together, that is what that comes from what would historically be called religion. So that's where.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if you want a short form definition of religion, it is the thing that creates the social fabric by allowing a contrast for virtues and values and the lack thereof. We'll say, right? Like can't have nice things without that. The only other point I want to add is that he does talk about constraining raw matter to support a definite point, seed. Right. Instead of its own wild expressions. And so that's just to put a sharper point on that idea that the thread will tangle if left undone. And therefore the point, and also the fact that the point and the seed are related and important concepts in this whole thing. So don't be thinking that emergence is good and you just start spinning away and that'll work. You still need the needles. And if somebody tells you there aren't needles, right? If somebody tells you there's a leaderless group, that's not a configuration that exists in this world, right? The groups may form leaderlessly, but they don't stay leaderless for long, right? And then, there's a transition period. Yeah, it's shorter than you think, right? And if you try to have a leaderless group, on average, and this has been proven experimentally for the sciencey minded, the most psychotic people will take over. Yeah, it's just almost inevitable, right? In other words, the most chaotic people will take over. In other words, the tendency from emergence, right, is still not to tighten. It's not rectification. It's not building. It's destruction and chaos and regression and loosening. So that's why mob mentality and mob rules and things like that tend to result in violence, right? So I just wanted to tie that together, just so you can see at all layers how these principles hold, and they're 100% at all the, say, fractal layers of reality.
Thanks for pointing that out, although you kept on going too long, so my pun fell flat.
Some good points, guys. If I can make one more point, Manuel, would you mind showing the diagram on page 194, actually? I know we're actually going backwards, but so just this aspect of the point and the seed being connected at the different fractal layers, which Mark just said, just that diagram just flashed in my mind. Just for the folks at home.
Yeah, and so the seed is like the birthing of a new space, effectively. So I did want to. Oh, we're going too fast. I did want to point out this idea of the Socratic method. I think, but don't hold me to this. I think technically the Socratic method is there to get to the heart of the matter, not to point out flaws. So, because that's basically what you're saying when you say, well, I'm using the Socratic method to point out flaws. That's bad faith, right? If you're in good faith, you're like, no, like we want to see what it's actually about.
Right. The modern, so-called modern, the more recent idea about what Socrates was doing is wrapped up somehow in Immanuel Kant, who no one should listen to anyway. And this idea of critique and critique of critique, which is a good hint that you're down the wrong path when you use the word to define the word, or you use the word twice to define something new. That's always a sign that everything's already off the rails, right? And I have a video on this on navigating patterns, right? This idea of cynical skepticism. That is not what Socrates ever did. If somebody tells you that, run away from them. Be polite, be kind. Don't listen to anything they're saying, though. Run away. That's not what was happening there. And that's actually really important to understand the difference between exploration and critique. To explore something is to, so like I could go to Castle and I could say, sounds like you know about jazz. Tell me about jazz. And I could just ask him questions over and over again. Tell me about your playing. Tell me about your experience. Tell me about, right? And just to dig in. That's not a critique. Like, all questions are not critiques, right? Or I could go to Castle and say, you said you volunteered at the aquarium, but did you? Right? And that's an accusation, which people also mistake for a critique, right? And it's an implicit accusation, so it's sneaky, right? And so we don't see the hierarchy and the distinction in different types of questioning, and we just sort of reduce them all to Socratic method, which is not correct. Not all questions are the sorts of questions that Socrates asked. So yeah, just beware of the cynical skepticism, because it plays on your ego and makes you think like, I can question this person about this thing because I read about it in a book. And it's like, no, I mean, there's certain people that they know they've been doing it long enough. Your ideas about this are, going to be wrong.
So let's put on the yoke. So the yoke is interesting, right? Because like it's set here at the top, right? But usually someone is steering the yoke, right? So there's a wheel above there, right? So and the insight I had is like the yoke is like the taming of wild energy, right? So we're all these processes that we're talking about, right? We're taking something from nature and then we're binding it to a purpose, right? And so in some sense, what is it? Well, the potential that is in nature is driven to a point, and I think Christopher pointed that out. Like the telos, right? And then the tool, in some sense, is serving you in being able to center that energy.
Yeah, and also a yoke is explicitly a constraint. And the advantage to a constraint, and if you've yoked an animal, you'll actually know this. The advantage to a constraint is that the animal now knows that the mode of participation in the world is changing because there is a focus, there is a thing to be done. You can see this in horses too. If you put a saddle on them, they immediately change how they operate in the world, right? And they're like, oh, we're going to do something. And from the horse's perspective, they probably don't know what they're going to do, right? I think if you're just going on a random ride, for example, and that's exciting to them, like, oh, I don't know where we're going, but I get to run around. And I don't get to pick the speed, but who knows what that'll lead to, right? Because it's comforting sometimes to have somebody else make the decisions, right? Because you get decision fatigue is a real thing. It's well measured. And so the yoke is an advantage because it allows you focus. And so you can see it as a problem. Oh, I'm yoked, but it allows you focus. It's how you get things done. If you're not getting things done, it might be because you're resisting constraint, resisting the yoke, resisting the thing that excludes, right? The thing that points you towards the direction, the thing that allows you to focus your power, and the thing that distributes that power, right? Which is all in this diagram, by the way, rather clearly. It's a little hard to read sometimes, sure, but and the yoke is the thing that allows for the rectification, right?
The yoke is on you, Mark.
That's a bad yoke.
So a little bit more down where.
Wait, could I add to the yoke? Sorry, big yoke fan. I was thinking about this thing of the pair of needles kind of coming together to focus power to distribute a point, and then we had that aspect of the point being analogous or deeply connected to the seed. And I just wanted to kind of more explicitly mention the I wanted to mention just kind of like the marital yoke, and just kind of make a slight sort of distinction there. So there is that whole aspect of like being equally yoked and that sort of thing, properly being able to distribute the power towards the point together, but also to kind of tie that also as a lot of times people kind of will misconstrue marriage as like the relationship between the two people as such, but it really is. It's the set of constraints that the people are agreeing to take upon them to then enable that new participation. So like the definition that I sort of understand is that it's a solemn contract for the raising of children and then the unification of the spouses, and that it's not the all-encompassing thing. But I was thinking about, have you ever seen those things? I was thinking about like chopsticks. Have you seen those little plastic things where you can like slot the chopsticks in for people that don't know how to use chopsticks, and then it just kind of, you can like squeeze it and it does the thing for you? I was just kind of thinking about that as an analogy between just kind of like state marriage, where it's just kind of like the courthouse type of thing, versus kind of like one that's actually nested within a tradition, being like an actual hand that has like a little bit more complex functionality. I don't know, but that's just what came to mind.
That's that goes into the difference between a marriage as a contract and marriage as a covenant. You've got, because you can have a contract between just two people, but a marriage has there's more than just the two people involved in the covenant. So
Right.
And that brings us to indeed a contract and writing a contract. And the insight that I had about the writing part is that the writing is binding spirit to matter. And then when bound, the freedom and nature of the word change, right? So when you express a word, it is contextual, right? Like there's a way in which it has fullness, it has aliveness. But when you write it down, you decontextualize it, right? Like you flatten it, you make it dead. So there's something that can be preserved in the writing down of things, but there's like a lot of things that cannot be preserved, right? So I think writing in the ancient times was mostly used for trade, keeping tabs, like administration and all that stuff, because like that's dead, right? Like no numbers don't care whether they're alive or not. But if you go beyond that, right, like law or a marriage contract or whatever, right, like you're gonna have to live that out, right? You're gonna reinflate those words. You're gonna enchant the world. Bringing it back down to the bottom of the page, it's like it says, these tools impose the rational patterns of space onto raw matter, right? So we're back to the constraint thing that Mark was pointing out, right? And through the constraint, the matter gets imbued with meaning and is able to participate at a different level. And it's interesting because they're talking about vessels, right? Like even writing is putting something in a vessel over time, right? Like it's being held, and the definition that I came up with for vessel is that they are spaces with set rules. It's not so much what they hold, but more so what they separate. So it is like when you look at a pot or something, right? Like it's not, what makes it a pot is not that you can fill it with water, right? Like it's that the water won't go out, like it won't mix with the outside. And so in that sense, right, like the identity of the pot is the constraint on the water, right, or the constraint on the external world to the water, like depending on how you want to look at that.
Yeah, I just want to point something out about that in particular, right? Which is that when we're talking about tools imposing rational patterns of space onto raw matter, one of the ways to think about the self-help movement, even, throw Jordan Peterson in here with 12 Rules for Life and stuff, is those are tools, right, for basically imposing rational patterns onto your thoughts. So clean your room is a telos, right, in the direction of, sorry, a telos towards a point, right? And that point is ordering as such, we'll say the physical world around you, because that affects your mental space. And so your mental space has to be oriented towards this idea of, you call it refinement, right? You call it rectification, whatever, it doesn't matter, both work, right? Back into, right, your mind, because as Peterson points out, like if you clean your room, like your thoughts improve. So by improving your thought to clean your room, right, to make that point of cleaning your room, it improves your thoughts, right? And now you can do other and hopefully bigger things. And he talks about that hierarchy of larger things. And so that's how to relate it, we'll say, to the personal, because that's kind of missing, or that I think that whole aspect is missing from the entire text here, which is fine. It's not intended to have it, as near as I can tell. But I wanted to add that flavor, because I think a lot of people are, and not that self-help is bad, but too much of it is for sure. I want to add that flavor of why self-help simultaneously works and never produces the result that people ultimately want, right? Because it's self-help, it's directed inward. It's not always able to connect to the wider world in that way. And every once in a while it does for some people, right? But really you want to have a top-down and emanation first approach, right? You want to start with creation and connect in that way instead, which is not to say, you don't employ, we'll say, self-help. I mean, clean your damn room. Yes, it works. All right. But know that these other larger connected tools, right? Know how that pattern of clean your room also applies to everything we're saying here, because those are the next steps. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3 in a staircase fashion, the way, say, Peterson talks about it, right? There's this multi-connectedness that comes onto the scene very early on, and then you need to develop that poetic way of informing the world in order to do that with the symbolism.
Yeah, no, I'm always annoyed with this self-help or this therapy, because yeah, they're never integrating, right? Like they're never taking things into account, and what ends up happening is effectively that they're presupposing that you're healthy, but you're just like a little bit off, and you just need to be corrected in your offness, but they can't actually straighten you out. Are we good on this page?
I think I just wanted to mention something about the coiling, like the making the snakes from wet clay and binding them into a solid vessel. It just kind of that aspect of taking a thing that is, seems like it would not actually properly host the identity, or wouldn't be able to provide the correct constraints, but under the right conditions, and then after being assembled, then being exposed to also the correct conditions for refinement, because you still have to run it through a kiln and all these things. While it's malleable, being able to do that and then introduce the light and heat to it and then allow it to cool afterwards just kind of reminded me of during Thanksgiving, I did a pumpkin pie, and I have a recipe that took me like a year to get down because it's sugar-free, and there's no wheat in it either. And I've given it to people. They can't tell the difference. It's amazing. But the thing is that in order to get this thing to not crack on the surface, you actually, the method that I found is that you pretty much have to essentially coil with the spoon. You have to coil the surface of the top of it. And then once you kind of reach the point, then you give it a seal. And then once you do that and you run it in there, you don't interrupt the process. Like you keep the oven completely sealed the entire time. And then you let it cool for like hours inside of the oven, and then take it out and then let it cool again and then put it in the fridge. Then it's ready the next day. But there's like multiple stages of refinement, and then kind of allowing it to then resettle again. And I just kind of saw a little bit of an analogy there with the coiling technique, so that you can actually have like a stable space, despite all of these other kind of transitional stages it has to go through.
So at the top graph on the right side, I associated that with artisans, right? So artisans, in some sense, they bind nature into culture or something, right? Like they take the raw material and they fit it into society in a way that it enhances society. And like I thought that was because we're, well, at least me, and I think Mark as well, right? Like we've been having discussions about like what is it, right? Like what is an artisan, like and like how's that different than an artist, right? Because in some sense, artists are focused on decorating, right? But it's interesting that if you take a little bit different perspective, you can see that if you have cobblers and like clothiers and all of these professions, right? They clothe the city. They clothe the people in the city, but also the city as such. And so they're creating like a living tapestry, I guess, right? Like a living artwork that you can participate in, right? And then if you have that frame as a living city or the living village, you can understand the church more as well, right? So it's like if all of that flows into the church, right? If that all culminates into a center, right? Which actually also then also points up as well. Um, you can see the functionality of binding, right? And basically that it's like an office of binding. It's like literally the role of yeah, the meta role of binding, so that everything else that's bound can be bound together in a proper manner. So it cooperates instead of being in sin. And like if we look at OnlyFans or whatever, right? Like that's a great example of something that's not bound and is actually parasitic, right? And then you get the argument, right? Well, who's at fault? Is it the parasites or the fact that the parasites can eat? It's like, well, yeah, don't be a parasite.
That is interesting, this bit where he talks about these crafts also serves a function comparable to that of books. Did you guys have any sort of insights on that? Like, I'm thinking of a few things in the background that I'm still kind of working on. But I mean, you've got the marginalia, you've got the nice, you know, outside texture and all these things, but then you have the writing skill, you have the compilation of these things, you've got, you know, presumably whatever sort of you know, evolutionary process is going on with this thing perpetuating across time, or actually being worth making in the first place, because at least traditionally, you know, in the times that he's kind of referencing, when these things were more standard, you know, it's extremely expensive to produce a book.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and say Matthieu did not do a very good job here. I think the better way to phrase this is to say that books are flattened representation of crafts. Right? Because the argument that we make is, well, and I make this in several places. You can just look at my last live stream on navigating patterns, because I made it there last night. the better way to communicate information is not speech, and it's not written word. The terrible ways to communicate, like flat out. You can whine and be upset about that all day long. It's in all the research for real. I bet nobody ever told you that, but if you actually go look and research it, which I have, it's there, right? But also you can see, like, I use my hands to talk. So I have facial expressions, right? I get my little gestures, right? It's much more rich. You can't convey emotion well on a page. Everybody knows that. Everybody says, well, you're being sarcastic? How come you can't convey sarcasm in a text? How interesting. How do you convey? Oh, wait, there's tone of voice. Very important. Also very dangerous. Can be enchanted by a sorcerer, right? So the richer thing enables more communication. And so the way to talk about this is a book is a flattened, right? But more universal, to be a little bit more fair, way of communicating information, right? And then you use information to create knowledge. But you create knowledge. Knowledge does not exist outside of your conception of it, right? Knowledge is how you put the information together. It's not an objective thing outside of your brain. So that's information, which is also not necessarily an objective thing outside your brain, because it's really just signals at some level. That's the knowledge engine model on navigating patterns. Check out, I've got a couple videos on that. So when you think of it that way, and he points to this, right? I mean, he says, failed to recognize them as repositories of spiritual knowledge, right? So if you go from the perspective of the book, now the problem with a book is, even though you didn't write it, when you conceive of a book, first of all, you read it, so you absorb the information in it, right? And then you think of it from that perspective out, because we're very individualistic, which is really bad for everything because it destroys the social fabric, as mentioned earlier. And then you look at the world that way, but that's backwards, right? Because books, especially really good books, will say a book about blacksmithing is a compression of a set of actions done over time by an expert or by a practitioner or an artisan. This is a better, right? And so we live in the age of gnosis, right? Where knowledge as propositions is the highest value, right? And then we're listening to experts, but not too long ago either, like maybe 60, 70 years ago, artisans were also around. Like, we knew what an artisan was. We talked about and to artisans, and you would never try to take a book and substitute that for an artisan. But we have taken books and substituted that wholesale for things like knowledge, which a book doesn't contain knowledge, it contains information, right? And then we have said that you can transport that, we'll say, purely or perfectly to another person. And if you just read this book, you'll see something. And that's not true. See now 3 videos on the lies that Plato has been accused of telling now, right? Because people are misapprehending Plato's cave. They're just leaving out a bunch of stuff from Book 8 that talks about how democracy turns into tyranny. That might be relevant right now, anywhere you are in the world, right? And then Book 10, which is my latest, that just came out on navigating patterns. Like, this is a disaster for people to read these books without understanding them, which is why you should check out the Texas Wisdom Community YouTube channel, where we did a book club on Plato's Republic and put some of this stuff to bed. But this idea that books are a shadow of artisanal participation, right, is I would say not highlighted well enough, or not contrasted clearly enough. Even though I would have said that a little bit differently. I probably would have filled in the page just to kind of give the sense of which way this goes. Books are a reflection of a participation. That participation may not be real. We call that fiction, right? And in nonfiction would be something like a how-to manual is considered nonfiction, right? Because that's about a real participation, or a participation you've had versus a participation that only happened in your head. It's another way to think about fiction and nonfiction. So that's why we're failing to recognize artisanal capability as a repository for knowledge. I would argue books cannot be a repository for knowledge. They cannot convey knowledge. You can create knowledge from books, but whether or not you're conveying what the author wanted is almost certainly not the case, because postmodern, or lit crit in general, but postmodern thinking broadly has destroyed our ability to submit to the author. And therefore, we're actually not getting the right messages out of these books, right? And so they're not conveying knowledge. They're conveying random information that you're misinterpreting because you're not the author, right? And it's not to say that all authors' knowledge is perfect, right? Or that they perfectly conveyed, we'll say, what they intended, or that in conveying what you intend, you also convey a bunch of things you don't intend, which is the quote critique, which is not a critique. It's just an observation of how the world is, of the postmoderns, which is why everything they say and do is invalid, and you shouldn't pay any attention to any of them, right? Because they're fundamentally parasitic, and they're parasitic in a way that appeals to your ego, and that will destroy the world. And I like the world, so can we just not? That'd be great.
Yeah, I want to put some side notes here, because ancient books are not the same as modern books. They were there with the explicit purpose of capturing spiritual truths. And besides that, ancient reading is not the same as modern reading, right? Ancient reading was more likely to be done in a collective, out loud. So if you look at it from that angle, right, like the book was literally, right, like you were invoking a spirit when reading the book, right? Like you were trying to reinstantiate that. Well, that's not what we're doing in modern reading of any kind, basically. So you could say that if you would do that correctly, you'd participate in the form of the book, right? If the book was written that way. So like that's the steel man for Pageau's position there, or the metalsmith man. Anyway, go ahead.
So there's a few things that kind of came to mind. And I think there was a really good comment here as well about this. But this thing about there's the flattening of the information in order to make the book. And this is, again, I really like the point about that originally with the ancient books, you would be trying to manifest a spirit or kind of give body to a spirit so that you could then remanifest that to an even larger body of people who are listening and a person who's speaking. And there's a hierarchy involved because it's very, very expensive to teach people how to read all those things, and let alone to even have the book. So you'd probably have like one for an entire town or something like that. But also this thing of, especially with like modern books. So if you have a person that is maybe they're flattening down the information so that they can communicate it, which is one thing, verbally, and then they're flattening it down yet more where people can't ask the book questions or anything like that. And then you have to, where normally with the ancient books, you would be making this trade-off of, to Mitchell's point about like having to sacrifice, in a sense, you'd probably also eat the meat and all these other things, but you would wind up having to trade a flock of sheep essentially in order to get this book. So you're flattening the sheep down, and then, or you're flattening down trees or something like that in order to give this thing a body. And whether or not there's actually a spirit attached to that, or if it's just kind of useless junk that's just flattened down stuff, that would be easier to just ask a person or watch them do it in action, might be better. But I really like this aspect of that the communication is not in the speech itself. So there was a thing earlier this week that I was just watching this video, and there was actually quite a series of videos where this guy was he's a martial artist, and he was showing a few of these people that were doing some sparring, and there was this set of guys who were like operating at an extremely high level. I think they were doing like Muay Thai or something, and they weren't fighting, like they weren't trying to injure each other, but there was a certain level of force that they had agreed upon, so it wasn't just like light tapping or anything like that, but they had padding, and these guys were going at it in a very skillful way. And the thing that the guy who was showing them said was, "What a beautiful conversation these guys are having." And I was like, that is exactly right. When I heard that like 2 or 3 days ago, where you see them and like, yes, they're striking each other and kicking each other and doing all these things, but there's like a mutual respect going on. And also you consider, like, a lot of times, especially with guys, I think like there is an aspect of bonding that happens when you're kind of, especially if you're sparring. And if this is something where it's like, we like to fight and we're at a fighting gym and we're at the top of our game and we've agreed on all the rules, and like we're just doing this very, very skillfully, that is absolutely a conversation. And they're probably bonding a lot better than they could have if they were, if they were just talking to each other as friends or something.
Yeah, there's a saying, you don't know somebody until you fight them. And that's
Yeah.
even made it into pop culture, right?
Yeah.
But people don't understand what that means, right? Because then they'll try to elevate something lower to something higher by saying something like verbal sparring.
Mm.
I'm not going to say there's no such thing as verbal sparring, but also let's be real. Come here, I'll spar with you for real, and we'll see if that's analogous to verbal sparring, right? Because when you do that, that is this. I'm not even being hyperbolic. That's the same as saying words are violence. It's exactly the same statement because it's within the pattern, effectively. So you have to be very, very careful. Now, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as verbal sparring, and maybe that's something that Manuel and I have done on numerous occasions.
We've sparsely done that, Mark.
Sparsely, yes. It's terrible, terrible. But also, it doesn't rise to the occasion, right? Because first of all, I can lose a verbal sparring battle, but I have yet to lose a sparring match, to be honest, because I'm just quick. So beware, right? They're not the same thing. And there are consequences to physical sparring. And there's a danger there. Like, the only danger to verbal sparring is you might get your feelings hurt if you're really weak and unworthy. But other than that, like who cares? Like, right, which is why I regularly insult my my lovely co-hosts here, both on stream and off, right? Because there's not much at stake, and there's a social fabric, right, holding us together. Not just the book club will say, like Christopher's on the Navigating Patterns quite frequently, at least in the comments, and and so there's a relationship there that I can sort of rely on, so that when I get a little wild or I hyperbolically try to prove a point like I did earlier, it's not a big deal, right? So being able to do that high contrast exemplification, like I did earlier too with Castle, that's actually really important, right? Because he's not going to take it personally, right? And then and he understands it's to show the audience something, right? Because my goal, I don't know if I've made this clear, but I've pointed at it, right? My goal is not to help the people here on the screen with me, we'll say alone, right? My goal is to help the audience, the people watching, or that will watch in the future. That's my primary goal, right? And I do that by helping the people here, right? That's the immediate process, right? Or immediate task that accomplishes my primary goal, right? And to do that, I have to do a lot of preparation, like make sure I've read the chapter, right, before we come on, right? And so you can see a hierarchy there. It's already, like, the hierarchy is already built into everything. And the way you tie the hierarchy together, or unify the hierarchy, you take the many into the one, if you want to use retarded, Platonic language, is through symbolism. You don't get there any other way. You can't do the binding without the tools, and you can't bind without a point, and you can't exist in the world without binding, because you just fall into chaos. And so all of that is sort of really important to understand. And I just, I wanted to make that point, that books can't bind you because you have to interpret them yourself, right? And maybe to the earlier point, if you're learning a book with other people, that problem is somewhat mitigated, right? Not fully, we'll say, but at least it's way better. See the Texas Wisdom community, the Republic book list, or obviously you're watching this book club, right? Like it's important to engage with that level of distributed cognition, with that fabric, in order to have the greater understanding of the text. That's why you shouldn't read books by yourself.
Yeah, going back to the book, like this is the point where this idea of the crafted objects, their repository of memories, and they are also like markers, like dogma, like the lights on the road of life that well, not delineate, but mark certain events, right? And I think binding here the idea of celebration. So there's these things. You could have the seasonal festivities, right, which are collective celebrations, right? But just the attainment of a resource, right? Like let's say you've got new new earthenware or new cups as a family, right? Just to celebrate that, right? Because like now that will change your future participation, right? Because like now the way that you're drinking is going to be different, right? Like, and you can ignore that, right? And you can just accept reality and just go on, or you can celebrate that, right? And like have these points of reference, and especially if you made the cups, like then things start becoming alive. And I like what I wrote down is that they decorate life. So that's how you make your own life beautiful, right? By imbuing it with your participation and celebration. Are we kind of complete with this, or
I'll just to your point of decoration and celebration, you use the fruits of your mundane labor to create your celebration. And so your celebration, in a way, is the celebration of all the hard, mundane, boring work that you've been doing, right? And the fruits of all of that labor. And so, in order to have the celebration, you need the boring, rote, mundane work. And that's what gives you the infrastructure and the excess to celebrate with. And therefore, the celebration is always also of that effort. And that's what ties together the lowest to the highest.
and to point back to points being seeds, right? Like the celebration is also a seed, because you plant something in your life, right? And now it can come alive through you. Um, and I guess since we're closing it up, I think that might actually be a good intention for the reflection, right? Like how do we make our life come alive? uh, and yeah, like ask some questions in the chat. Also reflect as we are, because reflection is important, because you kind of get to go over your participation again, and you can celebrate it, plant seeds into your life.
should address that comment, Manuel. Maybe explain the purpose of integration.
This one?
Yup.
Are we praying? Well, you could say it in a manner, but not specifically. So I see it more as a filtering, right? So it's a recollection, it's a remembrance. But when you're participating in a book club, especially if you have my role, right? Because I'm a leader, you engage in a certain way and you pick up certain things, you miss certain things, right? And so if you have some distance from what you went through and look back at it, then that allows you to to reflect and to see yourself, to see your participation and actually improve, right? Because like, how do you improve if you don't even see what you're doing, right? Let alone what you're doing wrong. If you don't even know what you're doing in your participation, like how can you change it, right? So we set our intention at the start, right? So if you look under our names, we set the intention there. So there's a way, which is really hard, by the way, but there's a way in which we're trying to structure our attention and our participation so that we lift certain things up compared to other things, right? And that changes what happens, right? We were talking about this being like a jazz, right? So you could envision your intention as an instrument, right? Because like I'm gonna have a certain tone when I focus on a point instead of on the string, right? Like if I focus on the head, the action, the point of contact instead of the weaving the product, right? Like you build a certain narrative, right? And so like and then right, like the whole purpose of this book club is to improve our lives, right? So we want to take what we're doing here and we want to bring it into our lives, right? So when I set the intention, right, like, and the intention was about like how do we celebrate things, right? Like is I'm I'm trying to see where I lack, right? Like I'm trying to use whatever insights I've gained um, to improve upon my life, so I can say what I found out, right? So like how do you properly celebrate and bind these things in your life? Well, like you do that by having meals, for example, right? Like if you have a meal, right? Like you make it into a feast, right? Um, then and you live towards it, right? Like, because I remember as a kid, I was like always like, "Mom, when are we gonna eat?" Right? So there's an anticipation, right? Like when you start including all these things, like life becomes alive, lively, and the dinner like when you just put something in the microwave and take it out like and you eat it, it's different than oh I'm hungry or like oh I really I'm curious what mom cooked today, right? Like it's completely different. And then um I think the other thing that I notice is what's important is you have to include other people, right? So like I'm just thinking about Christmas and decorating and all this stuff, right? But if one person in the family just decorates, right, and is not sharing, like is not involving all the other people in the decoration, like then the decoration is a little bit in the background, right? But if you know like why someone put something there, right? Like what's the decision making, then you can have a certain appreciation, right? And you can see the other person in the decoration, right? So now you have a shared reference, like that's what the inclusion is doing, right? And then if you connect these things also to needs, right? Because like you can decorate with like, for example, the dinner, right? Like if you're hungry, right? Like that's an actual need, right? And then fulfilling that need also has extra meaning, right? Like that there's a gratitude there. It's like, oh, like there's something that was necessary for me, like that I deemed necessary, that now got fulfilled, and I can be grateful, right? Like, and like then you actually have something to celebrate for, right? So, and then I also thought about giving, right? So like, how do you participate in the life of another, right? Like, how do you have the connectivity? Well, like I make your favorite meal, right? Or like I set the decoration and I pick the color that you like because now you're included in my decoration, right? Like stuff like that is important, right? Because now you're working on the relationship uh, that you have with the other person instead of like if you just pick your own color, then yeah, like you're just setting something up. Anyway, so that's kind of like, I hope that was a proper explanation. Does anybody else have insights they want to share?
So I do have a little bit. So I was kind of thinking about just kind of tying up all my loose ends, I guess, for the day and for the week. So I guess the intention that we were kind of spending some time on then was just how to kind of take all the mundane kind of toiling and work and properly kind of put that towards like decoration or kind of tying it together with something pleasant. And I guess I was thinking about this a little bit with respect to like the knitting and the crocheting, this participating in patterns and taking, so like with crocheting, for example, like you're just making the same move over and over and over again. I mean, that's really all it is, but it's participating hopefully in a higher pattern. And so you tie it all together, and then like in a sense, so the word celebrate, and this is something that I've seen like a little bit of contention on because people think celebration means like, you know, pachanga, everybody's partying or something like that. But really, like it's like numerous attendants. So in a sense, if you're doing a bunch of little loops doing crocheting or something like that, if that is participating in the pattern of like a hat or a scarf or something like that, that there is a bit of a celebration. Like you can even celebrate the fact that you spent, you know, a week making this thing or something like that. But also there's the numerous attendance of all of the work that you put into it to kind of complete the pattern. And then you do the final knot or you tie off the last little end and you snip it. And then everything is kind of contained. And just kind of thinking about that, I guess, within the context of, you know, we got Christmas coming up here. I recently had, this was actually last night, there was a cashier at a grocery store told me that he was a little bit dismayed that there was no Christmas spirit. People just aren't participating in like anything anymore. And he said, oh, you never, since all the lockdown stuff and everything like that, everybody forgot. You know, there's just like no one's, and it's like we saw this years ago with like Halloween and stuff. It's just 9/11 happens, no more trick or treating, gone completely. And so people just kind of forget these things. But I think really making sure to be intentional about participating in those proven and established patterns, hopefully something traditional, you know, and there's lots of opportunities. I mean, you know, I do this tiny little newsletter that kind of just like highlights the Saint Feast Day of every Friday. And it's been actually really helpful for me to just kind of be a little more grounded and realize, oh, there's actually feast days every single day. If I wanted to have something to celebrate, I can actually just look at the calendar and find something to celebrate that day if I just needed an excuse. And so if I had the extra resources, if I had been toiling and I needed some rest or something like that, I could actually do this. So that's something there. And I guess if I could just tie up one last loose end, the guy who asked about the praying and photosynthesis, I have jokingly said yes. Part of me is a mutinous rapscallion, and I would absolutely and do absolutely do that instead of the actual intended meditation. I would also reclaim photosynthesis out of the biological frame. And make that just a collecting or gathering together of light. So all of the insights or the light that I gleaned from this session, I am synthesizing that. So it is very much, I participate in a prayerful photosynthesis as we're doing that. And that's pretty much all I got. I think we're all tied up as far as I'm concerned.
Anyone else? Well, then we will tie this knot and call it a day. Next week is dreaming. So that's gonna be fascinating. One of my topics where I delved quite a bit into, like I was curious about the Jungian dream analysis. It actually was my portal into the poetic aspects of the world a little bit. So it's really useful if you start looking at your dreams. Let's just say it that way. And that's also Matthieu's next book, so that's also important. So see y'all next week. Hopefully, thank you for the participation in the chat. Like next time, try to be pointed with the questions so that we can integrate them a little bit more. We had a couple there, and again, we are really grateful for all the participation. See y'all next week.